Hello, I'm Greg Walker, and I worked with Madeline and Mal Thomas on our two research methods, which were Likert Scales and interviews. And so in this presentation here, I'm going to go over our research question, and then I'm going to talk about Likert scales, explaining the method, going through its strengths and limits, and then doing the same for interviews. Then I'll compare and contrast the two, as well as finally finish up with an integration. So our research question was, is the impact of technology on students inherently positive or negative? And so just to give you a little bit of a tidbit, because I know it's a pretty interesting topic for us in this program, it's dependent on how it's used and in the context of why it is used. And that's a theme throughout all of the literature. Orban and Przybilski also mentioned that in 2019. So kind of to summarize, there's strengths but limits. And it needs to be integrated in a meaningful and specific manner. And that was a study done by Castellano-Beltran in 2025. So method number one, using the Likert scale. So it's a quantitative measure that usually gives about 5 or 7 options. And if you're not familiar with the Likert scale, I could almost guarantee that you've seen one at some point in time. So what it usually entails is that you get you kind of have a continuum of responses that usually can kind of, you can indicate where your beliefs lie. So one example might be that the question would be, I am more engaged in class when we use digital tools such as Google Slides. And you might find one of the answers to be very engaged, and then just regularly engaged, then neutral, disengaged, and very disengaged. And in doing that, in answering that question, it kind of indicates what you believe about your engagement when digital slides is a kind of a piece of tech that's used in class. So very cut and dry, quite simple, and gives very clear data, generally speaking. So the Likert scale itself is associated with positivism or post-positivist paradigms. That's from Creswell and Creswell. And it produces quantifiable data that's ideal for statistical analysis. So under the idea or the kind of umbrella of positivism that knowledge is discovered through data and that reality is objective and can be measured, also all from Creswell and Creswell, those are all positivist kind of notions. And the Likert scale fits, while it can, support other paradigms or be used in conjunction with other paradigms, generally speaking, it takes on a very positivist worldview. Strengths of the Likert scale are that, number one, it allows for a lot of nuance when it comes to, as I mentioned, data that's on a continuum. So it doesn't take scores of, say, ability or skill in something, but it does focus on feelings, beliefs, and because of that, it's usually quite easy for people to answer, right? If I asked you to kind of, place where you are on the political spectrum, for instance, a lot of people have a very good idea of where they are at because that's part of their belief system. When you're asking about technology in the classroom, you get the same sort of idea. It's, you either agree or strongly agree, or you're very engaged, or maybe you're not. And usually it's quite easy for participants to tell where they are on that scale. With that, it's also pretty easy to analyze the data. So averages are really easy to calculate from this. And you can also you can find general trends quite easily. So for example, one example of that would be that 75% of students feel that they are more engaged when using a digital tool like Google Slides. That's not necessarily taken from any given study, but it was just an example that we decided to use. Other strengths include that you can gather a lot of information very quickly. And that quantitative methods, such as the Likert scale, are helpful to identify general patterns, which I mentioned before. So this helps with our research question because we are looking to figure out kind of, is tech positive or negative? And a big part of that is surveying people. And the Likert scale would be a very handy tool in that sense. With that, that would help us find averages, where majorities lie, or general trends to help us discover best practices. Limitations of the Likert scale is that, well, number one, it doesn't explain reasoning. And there's also language-based challenges, right? As with any question on paper, there might be reading difficulties. There might be varying degrees of nuance between people that say strongly agree with something and just regularly agree with another thing or the same thing. So where that line is that's, where the participant chooses to draw it. So sometimes there can be issues in terms of language. And also kind of going with that, education's complex, right? It's a social science, and it's very difficult to say that one size fits all, right? So sometimes you risk with a Likert that the data may be too generalizable or too simple. Again, you understand the what, but not the why. So while this is different from the notion of reasoning, this gives you an idea for what the feelings are of your participants, but it doesn't explain why that is the case. So that kind of naturally takes us into method 2, which is the interview method. So interviews give us a chance to get more in-depth responses about participants in regards to their thoughts and feelings. And it is a qualitative method as opposed to a quantitative method. So that's one reason we picked interviewing as well as the Likert scale. We kind of wanted that balance between the two, and we found that they both work very well for our approaches. So one thing that I will mention about interviews is that it's important that you use open-ended questions. So one example of what not to use would be a leading question, such as, you agree that digital tools improve your engagement, right? That would be a very leading question. And then a less leading question would be, do you find the number of tools and platforms that you use overwhelming? This kind of, the reason that one's leading is that it primes your students or your participants, I guess, that they're overwhelmed. Excuse me, sorry. So interviews are most commonly associated with constructivism. That's according to Creswell and Creswell again. And that they generate qualitative data that explains meanings, beliefs, and experiences. And that's great because it pairs nicely with Likert scale in that they both kind of cover each other's shortcomings. Interviews are hard to do on a large scale. Likert scale isn't. Interviews give you a lot of detail. The Likert scale does not. So, that's they kind of offset each other nicely. Excuse me again. So the idea of constructivism, just as a review for us, is that knowledge is constructed through experience. And so understanding experiences through interviews is potentially a great way to do that. It also understands that there are multiple realities, and these are based on individuals. So one person's thoughts and opinions on something may not match another person's thoughts or opinions on the same topic, but perhaps on a Likert scale, perhaps those two participants picked the same option. So strengths of interviews are that they are highly detailed as well as specific, and they collect emotions, thoughts, and experiences. They allow for clarification or follow-up if the interview is relatively unstructured. And Cohen, Mannion, and Morrison explain that interviews are valuable when we want to know more about perceptions and interpretations of events. Limitations are that interviews are extremely time-consuming, probably one of the most time-consuming methods, because generally speaking, you'll perform an interview in a one-on-one setting, and not only is that not ideal for researchers, but for participants too. It takes a special kind of person to not be very busy these days, I find, and so I could see where you might get some sort of skew in your results just based on that time requirement. It's also difficult, but not impossible, to statistically analyze the data. So you have to kind of do some interpretation, which, again, that leaves things up to the researcher. And again, bias can come in, creep in, perhaps. And it's not as nearly cut and dry as, say, a Likert scale. Again, interviewers have bias as well, right? Normally, well, they can. Sorry, they don't always have bias, but they can have bias. And I mean, the reality of it is this: if you're doing research, you're doing it generally to find something out. And if you are, invested in finding something out, you might have some sort of investment in that, in terms of, I'd love to figure out if this is the case so I can present it to my colleagues, right? Bias can creep in quietly and easily, and it's important to kind of understand that and be constantly aware of it. But as opposed to where a Likert scale can kind of sift out bias, interviewers kind of give options, or more options, for bias to become a factor. Comparing the two, interviews and Likert scales both serve different purposes, as I've kind of alluded to. So the question and statement sets could be broad or specific for either. One example of a broad question set would be that tech improves student learning in the classroom on a Likert scale. So another one might be that using collaborative digital tools such as Google Docs or Padlet increase student engagement during group work. So those are very general. With that, you could create an interview that has participants reflect on their experiences too. So the Likert would help you figure out the feelings, and then the interview would help you figure out the reasoning behind that. And that kind of nicely will work into kind of our final part of this presentation, which I'll get onto in a moment. So Likert scales will tell us what happened, they'll identify patterns, and they can be done with large sample sizes. Interviewers are better at figuring out the why, as we've mentioned, identifying themes and feelings, and can suit smaller sample sizes. When put together, right? So when we kind of integrate the two, we get a much better picture, right? You know the large trends, but you can also kind of narrow it down and really figure out why those trends are the way they are. Which leads us into just a short little bit about pragmatism. So this paradigm is it leads itself to mixed approaches. So using both the Likert scale with interviews. So Likert scales will measure trends. Interviews explain the existence of those trends. So for an example is we could figure out how does technology use influence instruction? And you might use Likert scale to figure out that it does in the first place. You might figure out what elements of technology are more or less influential, and then you might perform an interview with some of your participants, or maybe even a different participant group, to kind of figure out why certain things are more influential than others. Okay. Pragmatism, it kind of rests on the idea that reality has multiple interpretations. And so when you use mixed method approaches, you get a very kind of, well, maybe not a very, but in general, a much more clear idea behind the interpretations of reality, right? So you might understand one group's worldview and then another group's worldview. It might be different. Pragmatism is also very problem and solution focused. Excuse me, once again. So pragmatism kind of focuses on the problem and then tries to create the solution, or maybe not create, but find the solution out from that problem using the mixed methods. So in education, there's value in qualitative and quantitative data, we've found. And using one without the other is like having a classroom without a teacher. For our question, both methods are equally valuable and they complement each other nicely. That's another finding we had. To combine them both, the best approach would be probably to do short interviews with conjunction or in conjunction with a Likert scale survey. Creswell and Creswell emphasize the value of mixed methods approaches, and they argue that the same idea together, we can gain a more complete understanding of the research problem. Thank you very much for listening.